For this week's shipwreck video, we'll be looking at a bit of an odd one. A wreck that is partially above water, and a ship that is, for all intents and purposes, unique. A relic of a bygone age, in both design and history. That wreck is HMVS Cerberus, a remnant of Australia's colonial history and of a time where monitors were the popular ship. This wreck has several features that make her stand out. However, this is also a wreck at real risk of breaking up. Cerberus has been rusting away for nearly a century, and the Hulk shows that as she steadily breaks apart. Various plans have been put forward to stabilize the situation, but to my knowledge, none have gone through, and Cerberus remains an imperiled piece of history. Now, with all of that out of the way, how did Cerberus end up in this position? Well, for that, let's talk about what this ship was. First and foremost, a relic of colonial Australia. The HMVS in her name relates to that topic. Her Majesty's Victorian ship. That's not directly in relation to Queen Victoria, although it was during her reign. No, that's in relation to the colony of Victoria, from the days before Australia was unified, which was, admittedly, named for Queen Victoria. At the time Cerberus entered service, in 1870, Victoria had its own naval force. Not a large one, but large enough to be its own thing. Thus, HMVS Cerberus, a ship that had a fairly quiet career. Not terribly surprising for a monitor based in Australia. There were no major conflicts in the area during her service life. The ship never sailed far from home and never fired her guns in anger. This career would last from August 1870 until 1924, during which the ship had two name changes. First to HMAS Cerberus when the shift to Royal Australian Navy came in 1911, and then to HMAS Platypus on April 1st, 1921, to reflect a change in role from coast defense to submarine tender. By this point, the ship was thoroughly obsolete, and her guns hadn't even worked properly since 1914. This new lease on life would prove short-lived. Cerberus was decommissioned in 1924, and then sold for scrap on April 23, 1924. However, the ship would only partially be scrapped. The most valuable parts were removed, but much of the hulk remained intact. In fact, only one of the turrets even had armor removed from it, which you can see in the modern day with these two pictures. Not to mention the guns remained aboard. Apparently, the cost to scrap Cerberus outweighed the scrap value of her metal. Considering it was 1924 and the Washington Treaty was leading to a mass scrapping of warships, this probably isn't surprising. The steel market had plenty to work with. In any case, Cerberus was towed out to Half Moon Bay near Melbourne, where the hulk was sunk as a breakwater, in 10 feet or 3 meters of water, just 650 feet or 200 meters from shore. And she has remained there for just under 98 years as of this upload, steadily rusting away as no one bothered to keep the ship maintained. Not that you'd expect that for a breakwater, mind you. Although, that said, it has led to the ship gradually falling apart over the years. There's relatively few surviving photos of the Hulk's early years. The ones I'm putting on screen now show a mostly intact wreck, right down to the superstructure and turrets. However, I'm not sure if these are from her time as a tender or as a breakwater. The pictures aren't dated. Nonetheless, they're a good look at the ship, especially after she left active service, one way or another. Now, with that out of the way, let's move on to pictures of the wreck ranging from fairly old to pretty modern. These will show how much the wreck deteriorated from the 1960s to the modern day. That decay can be tied to a couple sources. The march of time, of course, being the major one. Time and the effect of tides and weather, with the other factor being human impact. For many years, locals and tourists alike would board Cerberus. People would even have picnics on her rotting deck while poking around the superstructure and the turrets. This isn't inherently a problem on most ships. However, Cerberus is old. Even when people were poking around her decks, this ship was an antique. And unlike museum ships, she was not being maintained. So people wandering around the ship, even if they didn't take anything, would have worn her down. Maybe not to any noticeable extent, at least at first. But after decades of that, coupled with the passage of time, well, the combination of the two has worn the ship down. This is apparent looking at pictures like this one, where you see the hulk still largely intact, above water with the deck planking in place. However, the superstructure is bare. Just the turrets and what I believe is the conning tower remain, with a lot of graffiti covering everything. While I don't have a date, the quality of the image and the peace sign lead me to think this is the 1960s or 1970s. Maybe the 1980s at the high end. We can see another image here from another angle. There's less apparent graffiti, and the rusting isn't quite as bad either. However, there aren't many details to speak of. There's the size of the monitor compared to the sailboats next to her, and a sign of some sort here, but I can't make out what it says. You can also see that the wreck is still in one piece, at least at this point, right down to the shape of the bow and the structures on top of it. Something you can see better here in a picture taken aboard Cerberus. This looks like the bow, judging from the equipment in frame, and for that matter, the graffiti, specifically the KEN on the turret, which you can see in both pictures. The notable thing about this one, however, is the deck. Even if we assume this is the 1960s, that's still 40 years of exposure to the elements. And the deck looks perfectly fine. The individual planks in place without any apparent rotting. Whatever paint they might have had is long gone, but the planks are still there. If this is the 1970s or 1980s, that makes it even more impressive. The people on the side are probably an example of curious visitors, or locals visiting the ship for one reason or another. Before we move on, I have a couple more pictures of the wreck above water. First, this one from above. At this point, Cerberus was still firmly above water. You can see the deck and the side of the hull with no signs of a list. Whenever this picture was taken, the hull hadn't deteriorated at least that much. And then there's this much closer in picture from the superstructure, looking down on the bow, which is again perfectly intact. There's no real signs of damage here, aside from some rusting. Now for the last above water image, where we can see two things of note. First, that the hull has started to list slightly, and second, that Cerberus is sinking. She's lower to the waterline, and the rusting is much worse here, which leads directly into what the ship currently looks like. In 1993, Cerberus suffered a major collapse. Her hull frames and deck supports began to give out after all that time in the water, leaving only deck frames keeping the deck and superstructure from caving in completely. Moreover, as you can see, the ship sank deeper into the water. Cerberus has been gradually subsiding deeper and deeper into the bottom. Because of this, the Australian government put a 100-meter or 330-foot exclusion zone around the wreck. No one is allowed to board her or swim around Cerberus. A body was found aboard the wreck in 2010, further reinforcing that decision. And when you look at the wreck, it's easy to see why. There's very little left above water, and anything beneath the waves is only going to get worse as time goes by. the water is going to be rusting the metal and rotting the wood at an accelerated pace. You can already sort of see that looking at the wreck from directly above. Compare how the parts underwater look to the parts above the surface. This isn't like Endurance, which I covered last weekend. Cerberus is in warm and very shallow water. The parts beneath the surface are only going to get worse every year. You can see that in this picture too, as well as an interesting detail. The hull is listing a little bit. Water is starting to go over the superstructure when at higher tide. That list and the tides are more apparent here, where you can see green starting to overtake the bleached wood, and more rusting on the turrets. That is likely why the parts above water, as seen here, are getting rustier. Cerberus is falling apart and will probably not last much longer, in the grand scheme of things, despite various proposals being put forward to try and preserve the wreck. Although the one proposal to fix things by filling the wreck with concrete, well, I'd be fine with that one not being pursued. In any event, that brings us to the last set of pictures. As part of the effort to save the Hulk, the guns were removed in the early 2000s. They were coated in preservative and left on the seabed next to the wreck. You can see that here with the empty turret top. While they were aboard, the guns were a popular attraction. For admittedly good reason. These were big, rusty iron monsters. 10-inch muzzle loaders, which weren't exactly common to look at. And probably one of the most interesting things on this wreck. That went for looking at them on top of the turrets, like here. It also went for looking at them from inside the turrets, as seen here, where both the guns and mountings were still intact. However, the weight of the guns was too much. Taking them out lightened the load on Cerberus, so I can't argue the result, even if it does mean we only have pictures like these remaining, foreseeing the ship with her guns still in place. When they were aboard, they certainly made for a striking image, although I'm not sure I'd climb on top of them like this guy is. Regardless, we've reached the end of the video, with this one picture. Cerberus nearly completely underwater, with waves lapping at her rusting turrets and flooding holes in the deck. I do hope that a plan goes through to save this ship. She's a valuable historic relic and deserves better than falling apart into the Australian seabed. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.